Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode. I forget what we're on. 4, I think, of Law and Order. Uh, Me, Rob Noerrdor, not an attorney, and my great attorney friend, Ryan Mullally. How are you doing this getting close to Christmas here? How's everything going with you and your family?
Pleasure to be here, Rob. Pleasure to be here, and yeah, it's great. It's a wonderful time to have young children, right? I mean, I know your kids are young, if I recall correctly, right? Like
Yep, 4. He's 4. Yep.
they make the whole thing seem exciting and new again, right?
I never even really cared about like the celebration of the tree and the lights and all of that stuff until I had a son, and now it's like something that he's into, so I'm into. But yeah, the one thing is like he has been better these past like 3 days because he's like, oh, Santa's watching. So just a little more like taking his cup out to the sink and putting it. It's like, all right, it'll be good for another week. So
Yeah, I mean, get whatever you can get. It's the holiday season, right?
yeah.
Got to have something for Poppy too. It's,
So we, as always, there's no shortage of legal topics to cover. On this show, we like to look at sort of things in a legal perspective that's going on in the political world and not really giving so much what we want to see, but trying to call it down the middle as much as possible, giving the legal theories and such. I'm bringing it through to Laura a layman's way of looking at this, and Ryan's going to give us all the answers to all the questions we have. So, I think a story that fresh on people's minds, given the guilty verdict that we just got. Judge Dugan, for those that don't remember this story, this was the judge that there was a person in her court. I believe the charge he was in front of her for was more of a domestic dispute type situation.
Mhm.
She found out ICE was in the lobby. Allegedly opens back doors and whatever to try to give this person that ICE was looking for a way to escape them. She has been found guilty, and so I thought that would be a good way to open the show. What's your takes on this? Did you think this was a case worth prosecuting? Do you agree with the guilty verdict? Where do you expect it to go from here?
Yeah, this is a fascinating case, and the politics were kind of just ever present in this one. Like if you listened to reporting on closing arguments, the defense was saying, jury, this is your moment. This is to have a, I think what's the phrase they use? They said to hold power accountable,
Yep.
right? And the prosecution said this is not a referendum on, you know, the ICE policies or the immigration policies of the country. This is about the simple question of whether or not a judge can step off the bench, leave the courtroom, leave her zone of authority, and obstruct government officials conducting their job. And the answer is no, you can't. It was fascinating. I think it should be an object lesson to everybody, because even someone as learned as a state judge can fall victim to this, what we call TDS, this idea that your personal politics have become so important to you that they acquire legal significance and they justify you taking illegal action, and they don't.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are other cases, and obviously there's different levels of this. I'll be fully honest. I think a lot of people on my side of the ledger that are more likely to support Trump, or at least be against a lot of the what I would call lawfare against him. Sometimes we go too far in saying every court case against Trump, oh, this was TDS. But certainly it exists. And I think that this was a good sort of example of that. And there wasn't even a veil of sort of like, well, I'm holding the Trump administration in contempt, or I'm ruling that they can't do what they're doing, which sometimes that happens and it's clearly beyond the scope of what like a local judge would be able to do. This didn't even have that veneer. This was literally just like rank what an average person could do. Just like straight up, hey, I'm helping obstruct, I'm helping you avoid law enforcement. And it really shocks me. And I think it goes to sort of the political environment we're in that I don't even think there was a reasonable defense for her, other than just like, look, I'm morally virtuous. That's it.
Yeah.
And I think it's really dangerous when even the officers of the court are starting to think that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think her defense was that she didn't have the requisite corrupt state of mind. But I think that does come down to what you were saying on some level, that like she's not corrupt because she perceives herself as virtuous, which is not, that's just not a legally cognizable defense. And really the nail in the coffin from the way, and this wasn't, I don't think there are TV cameras, so a lot of this is secondhand, but from the reporters who were in the courthouse, they were saying that one of the prosecution's star witnesses was another judge who she called and went out into the hallway with her, and the other judge was talking like how inappropriate she felt this all was, like to the point where, and I clerked, so I worked for a federal judge for a year, and that's kind of where you learn how the courtroom works and how the system works. And I can tell you, like, my judge never was in public places out, with his robe on. Because when you have the robe on, you're the judge, you're in the courtroom, your word is command. Like it's not, you don't mix these roles. So the witness judge was saying, well, why do we have our robes on if we're in the hall? Why are we given the impression that we have some kind of authority out here? Why are we doing any of this? Like this strikes me as just not as an inappropriate thing to do. And I think that contrast was really striking for the jury, where they had, one judge talking about a colleague and saying, I really don't understand why this happened.
I think it's funny because I'm of the belief, as someone, I know we've talked about this as a theme for the show, I'm someone who's more of a like break the system down. Mm-hmm. And you're like, okay, but when that happens, how do we build it back up? As such, when I'm looking at politics, although I think it's lamentable how sort of there's been sort of a lowering of like sort of, I don't know what, like professionalism in the political sphere, sometimes that doesn't bother me. I don't mind my politicians speaking real from time to time. It goes too far, like I think Trump with the Rob Reiner stuff, which I could talk about for 2 hours and a half. Yeah. But I don't mind, like, I don't mind Trump, like, when he says, to use a little blue language here, like when he's talking about Israel-Palestine, they don't know what the fuck they're doing. Now, 30, 40 years ago, that would have been unheard of for the president to say something like that in public. But I understand, and I get that it's a little more humanizing, and maybe that's relatable to the people. But judges need to be beyond that. Like, officers of the court, even if we see politicians start to speak in a little more of a common man vernacular, judges have to continue to at least have the air of impartiality, even if me and you and everyone else to varying degrees of understanding the legal system understand that they'll have a bias, and that's natural for all humans. They have to at least have that appearance of professionalism. And, like, can you talk about that a minute, like, why that's important? Like, you just sort of talked about having the robes sort of there in public, but if judges go the same way as what we see now, presidents, senators, Congress people, that's really dangerous, isn't it, for the people at large to be like, oh, this person's just as partisan as me or you, is just equal to those whims as me and you.
Yeah, it's part of why I get, I know one of the things I get touchy about is when people start calling the Supreme Court like hugely biased or unfair, because there's a dangerous game you play there, right? Where once you start getting into this game of attacking the judges and saying that they can never be fair, they'll never be fair, they're all in their partisan hats, right? Well, how far does that go? What does that leave us with, right? Like, because if we want to be a nation of laws, we have to believe that the game, the system isn't perfect. It's not, but it's pretty good. It's the best game in town. It's the best legal system in the world. And we should be proud of that, right? Does that mean it always gets it right? Fuck no, it does not. Does that mean that there aren't judges who make corrupt or bad decisions? No, it sure doesn't. There's all kinds of examples, but the integrity of the system is important. Otherwise, when you get hauled into court, you have no hope that it's going to be a fair thing. It's going to be a rigged game. Why wouldn't you take extreme action in that context? So, I think part of that is on us as society, but the other part is what you said, that the judges need to be scrupulous, right? Like, this is why the Supreme Court doesn't hit back when they get hit, because they don't want to wade into this. This is why the other judge was saying to Judge Dugan, if we're going in the hall, take off our robes, because we shouldn't be pretending that we're exercising our judicial authority, that we're exercising our impartial role as judges while we're in a hallway directing traffic. That's not a thing judges do. That's a thing private citizens do. And we need to keep those roles separate. It's kind of like if you went to a doctor, right? And instead of wearing the white coat, the dude was just wearing like ripped jeans and a Motley Crue t-shirt. You'd be like, wait a minute. Like, I feel like something's off here. I think this dude,
like, smoking a cigarette, like, all right, let's get this shit done.
Like something's off here. This guy doesn't seem to understand what role he's playing, right? Like, the judge wears the robe in the courtroom. They don't wear it when they're, in the hallway. It's symbolic, but the symbolism is important.
Yeah, and I think that you know, it's one of the things that this isn't the best thing to say, right? And I think it confuses a lot of people talking about what is and what ought to be. Sometimes, like, I understand that there are people that are corrupt, right? Like, I understand it more of a political calculus. So people will do moves that I'm like, of course, I understand why a corrupt partisan hack would do this. Sometimes, though, what shocks me is that they couldn't even have the most base level of covering it up. Like an example I use all the time, the heavy set lady from Georgia, the black lady that ran for governor and lost. I always forget her name. Abrams.
Well, Stacey Abrams, yeah.
Yeah, okay. When during the pandemic, she goes into this elementary school and she takes these photos,
Mhm.
right? And all the kids who are at almost no risk for the pandemic are wearing masks, and her who's heavier set, which puts you at risk, and older than the kids, which puts you at more risk, isn't wearing the mask. And like everyone's like, well, of course, she doesn't really care about this. Yeah, that I get. But what I find more shocking is no one on our team was like, this is a bad look. What are you doing? Like, it's all right to not. I mean, it's not all right, but you understand that level of it. Like, sure, politicians, like, and we're going to get to it with the Epstein story. We're going to talk. I don't think that there's basically
Mhm.
more than a handful of politicians that care at all on either side about the victims. But that aside, there's ways to act to make it seem like you care. It's the same in this case with this judge. It's like, look, you at least have to. We get it. You're biased. You hate this. Great. But you at least have to have plausible deniability, right? You have to be like, oh, no, 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 no. That's not what this was about. This wasn't me acting outside the scope of being a judge.
Mhm.
Let me give you an explanation. And I think that the reason that it's important is because it illustrates, I don't think, listen, we make fun of, like, some of the justices, Jackson, like, for maybe not being the most intelligent, but she's still intelligent compared to an average person, right? Like, it, no matter what, right? DEI questions aside, this judge doesn't strike me, Dugan, as an overly dumb person. And that makes it all the more frightening because for her to just feel that we're in a political environment where it's like, nope, I don't even have to have the veneer. I don't even have to have plausible deniability. I just think that now is the time to act. It really makes you wonder how many other judges have that mentality and maybe they're ruling through the bench as opposed to taking some outside scope action like this. It
Well,
really is frightening.
that's what's really strange about it is that like it's almost like the veneer of sanity cracked a little bit there because you talk about ruling through the bench. Well, judges have broad immunity for what they do on the bench. Like you'll never bring a judge up on criminal charges for having a bad ruling. Like that's just legally, it's a legal impossibility, is what I would call it, right? Because judges make mistakes and they're protected from making mistakes, and judges have almost total control over their courtroom and their docket. And like I can tell you from experience that judges live in a world where they are the boss of everything, right? Like no, like yeah, the appellate court can tell them what to do, but the appellate court's pretty far away, and you hear about from them every once in a while. But in the judge's day-to-day life, they are the boss of everything and everyone, right? But most of them are really careful to understand that their purview is very specific and very limited. And yeah, they might put their thumb on the scale where they think it's warranted, but that's their job on some level. They're a judge. This thing about kind of trying to sneak him out of the courtroom, and there's a big hubbub about the fact that she took him through this private door, right? So that he wouldn't go where ICE was. And then there was a stairway so he could get downstairs. Now, of course, he was apprehended outside the courthouse. But trying to stealth somebody down a hallway, down a staircase, and out of the courthouse so that they're not arrested by federal authorities. That's not a thing that judges do. That's not a judicial role. And it's weird that she wasn't careful about that. Like that's the thing that I keep wondering about. Like she felt so obviously she felt strongly about this, but her feeling strongly about it overrode her kind of like legal discipline. And that's odd to me because judges are not notorious for being that kind of person, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Now, I want to get back to something you mentioned there about holding judges accountable. But before that, to sort of wrap this up, two questions now. This is going to go to the sentencing phase. So she's
Mhm.
been found guilty. So do you have an idea of what she'll be sentenced to? And then, second question, aside from that, even if she never does jail time, what's this going to do for her career? Will she
Yeah.
still be allowed to be on the bench, or what happens there?
Well, let's put an asterisk down because there is some appellate risk in this case.
Okay.
So, assuming that she doesn't win on an appeal, and we can talk about that, it is very unlikely she does jail time. I think it's very likely that it's going to be some kind of like supervision, that sort of thing. And the reason is when you give a jail sentence, there's a range, and when first time offenders are at the bottom of the range, she's a first time offender, but then also you put in things like flight risk to the community, these sort of factors, right? No matter how much trash we might talk in this show, she is not a flight risk. She is not a risk to her community. She's not going to be gunning people down at 7-Eleven now. This is not that type of criminal. So I think that I think the odds of her getting jail time at all are pretty low. Significant jail time, vanishingly slim. Maybe she has like 10, 15 days, but I think that'd be like the ceiling of what I would expect. But in terms of her career is basically over. I think that she's been suspended, so she doesn't have any active cases while this is ongoing. So that's already been a huge issue. She's almost, if she doesn't resign, she's almost certain to be impeached, which would be a huge black mark on her career. And she may face consequences. Like it's possible that there's a legal angle where someone could try to get her taken off the bench for having a criminal conviction. But particularly because of the impeachment risk, I think there's a really good chance she just resigns. If I was advising her, I'd be like, you don't want that smoke. Like, you don't want to get impeached, get torn through the mud again, like resign, go into private practice, be a lawyer. But I think she very likely loses her judgeship as a result of this.
Well, she could always get hired by CNN or MSNBC, and I'm sure they'd be happy to have her. It's kind of a joke, but not really. Like,
no,
you see her,
would.
A year from now, legal expert, Judge Dugan. That's kind of funny. The question, it's sort of tangentially related to this case, but something you were talking about, we hadn't discussed this as something to potentially talk about. So if you don't have thoughts on it, that's fine. But
can I do the appellate risk real quick?
Yes. I'm sorry, please. Yeah.
Okay. There's a weird thing in this case where there was a misdemeanor and a felony, and she got acquitted of the misdemeanor and convicted of the felony, which is interesting. So,
that is weird.
Yeah, it's unusual because they're also like pretty similar. So the misdemeanor, it's a misdemeanor to conceal somebody, preventing their arrest, and it's a felony to obstruct justice, right? And one of the things they're going to try to point out in appeals, like, well, how is it that she was acquitted of concealing somebody from arrest, but convicted of endeavoring to obstruct justice? I think the answer is A, there's an endeavor, like she was trying to obstruct justice because she didn't succeed, right? They arrested him. So she didn't actually conceal him from the police. But there's also there might be some legal niceties to that. So I think that's going to be a thing that they're going to put up on appeal for sure. And then I think they're also going to challenge materiality. They're going to say, like, all right, so she let the guy out the back door, but like you caught him 30 seconds later. Like, does that actually rise to the level of a criminal conviction? I don't think either of those are very compelling arguments to me. I think the first is better than the second, but I think they'll make them both. So there is a chance that this gets overturned, is I guess what I would say.
Yeah, especially the second, because if you see, there's actually footage of it. You can actually watch. He does make it out the back, and then one of the agents notices him, like, as he's on his way into the elevator and follows him, and they have to chase him down by foot, and they catch him maybe a 30-second chase by foot outside. He could have gone away. I mean, think of all the intervening circumstances. What if 3 or 4 other people out there and get in front of the police? Now, all of a sudden, that judge's actions reasonably did lead to this. So that doesn't seem that would be as big of an argument, though. I mean, as you could contest to, you're throwing everything against the wall in like a defense or an appeal scenario. So why not bring it up? But yeah, the first one is interesting. I had not heard that, and I think that is interesting.
I know. I agree with you on the second one being kind of I wouldn't call it frivolous, but it's a weak argument because it's kind of like, well, if if the guy that she, blatantly, I mean, it was very obvious what she was doing. There's no real dispute that she was trying to obstruct justice, right? Like, I think we all know that.
Yes.
But like, if the guy was Usain Bolt, he gets away.
Right.
If it was you or me, he gets tackled by ICE. So is it like, is she saying that because the guy wasn't like a good enough sprinter, she should be immune from criminal prosecution? That seems very strange, right? Like, that's just not, that just can't be the law. So I would agree with you on that one. The other one is weirder though, because the overlap is so huge. And the argument her attorneys are going to make is what the jury did is like legally incomprehensible. It couldn't be the case that if you go through the elements, that she did not conceal, but did obstruct by concealing, right? Like that's going to be the argument they make. But again, I think there's an attempt element. You can endeavor to obstruct. It doesn't need to be effective.
Right.
And, to me, that still seems like a weak appeal, because she's going to be saying, well, I wasn't endeavoring to obstruct justice when I ushered this guy out a door that nobody ever uses and ushered him down a staircase to obviously escape law enforcement. Like that, I don't think, I really just don't see a court of appeals saying, no, that's fine. We're gonna have that precedent. That's a totally okay thing to do.
What do you say to someone that's coming at things from more of like disliking Trump or the Trump administration that might hold this up as an example of like selective prosecution? This is classic Trump going after his enemies, his team going after the enemies. What do you say to that?
Look, the thing is, this was a down the middle crime. Like, I think we're probably going to talk about like all the funny, like there's some funny charges, right? Like the sandwich guy charge, right? Where it's like, all right, that's technically a crime, probably, but like, no, it was so minor that maybe it doesn't need to be charged. Like, there's all kinds of arguments you can make there. This was, if you take Trump out of the equation, like let's pretend this wasn't Trump. This was President Obama, and this wasn't. Let's not make it ICE. Let's make it the FBI, right? This guy was wanted for terrorism, and the judge ushers him out the side door. Right? Like, you can't live in a world where state judges are attempting to obstruct federal law enforcement when they are attempting to enforce federal law. Right? Now, there can be territorial disputes about, like, are you allowed to arrest in a courthouse? When? What's the policy? Like, there's all kinds of niceties there, but none of that changes what she did. Right? So, I mean, this was a clear crime. I don't think there's a lawfare argument to be made here, because no administration would countenance this.
The way I put it, because I had that come up to me, and this is what I said to a friend of mine in real life. It was like, imagine during the Biden administration, some state judge has someone in front of them for something benign, like parking ticket, something. Mm-hmm. But then also there's a warrant out in their arrest because they were protesting in an illegal way at Planned Parenthood, right? Now the judge happens to be Christian. Well, let me let you out the back then. Right? Everyone would say, yeah, you can't do that. Mm-hmm. The judge can have their feelings on what they think about going after, but you can't do that. Right? It's not up to that judge to decide whether or not these felony law enforcement or the federal law enforcement officers are correct in their apprehension. That's outside the scope of a state level judge. So I know it checks the boxes but Trump's using lawfare against all of his opponents. But I think as far as any of the charges that I've heard accused of that, this has to be the most blatant one that's like, no, that's not what's happening at all. This would be charged amongst any administration for any attempted law enforcement apprehension, let alone ICE.
It absolutely would. But I do hope that this calls attention to the fact that these sanctuary city policies are not benign, right? Because that's really what these are. Like, this is like a judge tried to write her own sanctuary policy into her conduct, where she said, oh, well, I'm not only am I not going to help the federal government, I'm going to actively obstruct them. And it's going to ruin her career. It's going to cost her. It's going to be something that she's going to regret. And I think you see this all the time. Like, I talk to someone I stream with sometimes, lawyer. She goes by Lawyer Chick, and she's more left-leaning lawyer. And she made the point earlier that sanctuary city policies are kind of toothless. They just make people feel good about themselves. I'm like, no, they're not. Like they prevent states from cooperating with federal law enforcement, which is a big thing to prevent them from doing. And here, the spirit of that endeavor is exactly what led to this. Somebody said, like, well, you know what? Federal law is less important than how I feel about Trump's immigration policy. And that's not a that's a I mean, if she wasn't a lawyer, I'd just say that's an ignorant thing to do. But she's a judge and a lawyer, so it's just poor judgment.
Well, and as we talked about in a debate panel we are on outside of this show, the problem is with a lot of these sanctuary policies that have gone too far. It used to be, regardless of what you think on what deportation should be. I know I have my thoughts, right? But it used to be that the cooperation was such, at least there was an agreement that there was cooperation with the most heinous of accused criminals. Oh, you're accused of being a drug cartel member. You're accused of murder. And that's sort of gone. Now the mentality is like, nope, we won't work with federal officials in many of these sanctuary places. And that's what leads to, okay, well then ICE is going to go in these cities and operate on their own. If you're unwilling to even have the most base level of cooperation, and I think that this case illustrates exactly that. This is exactly the places that you would want ICE to be if even a judge is like, nope, I'm so against deportations that I will risk my career in a moment of, temporary terrible judgment, I guess we could say, to do this. So it's very dangerous. And it's going to result in someone getting hurt eventually. I mean, even this case, how do you know? Like, I know this is stupid to look at, but this guy fleeing from law enforcement's no joke. Let's say he gets behind the wheel of a car and flees and he hits an innocent person. So like someone's going to get hurt or lose their life over some incident like this. And it'll be really tragic when it happens, regardless if it's the person that's fleeing ICE or it's someone outside the scope of that or an ICE officer themselves.
Well, I mean, think about it. If you didn't have sanctuary policies and you instead had like Obama benefited from in his first term, a robust framework where cities and states and municipalities cooperated with the federal government, at least when they arrested somebody from a crime of a serious enough threshold, right? Well, like you said, this guy was booked on a domestic beef, right? So, okay, let's assume that crosses the threshold. Well, then he's arrested. There's an ICE detainer. He's referred to ICE. There's no raid. There's nobody in the courthouse. Nobody's put in this position. The public doesn't have to deal with the specter of a chase, right? Like the whole thing is actually better. It's much, much better when the cities cooperate with the federal government. It's a cleaner system. And quite frankly, I think local cops are better positioned to do this work. They know the people. They know the neighborhoods. They're trained in this way, whereas ICE is more of a paramilitary outfit. Like I think it's a much, much better system. But if you look at the websites, just like what do these sanctuary cities say about their own policies? They'll very openly say, we do not cooperate with federal officials on immigration without a court order, right? We'll document it and then we'll say no. So it's like, well, if you're not going to cooperate, then they're going to show up. That's how they enforce, because you're not helping. What else can they do? They can either not enforce it or show up. So now they're showing up, and that's why they're in the courthouse, because there isn't the sane alternative has been turned down.
Right.
And, what are you going to do?
Yeah, and that's exactly what my feelings are. Now we're in a tight spot because this has been when you factor it into political decisions like during the Biden administration that allowed tens of millions to come in, and then you have all these sanctuary spaces. Now it's like, okay, if the American people legally vote, okay, we want deportations to happen, and now we're at this spot where it can't be done in the smoothest way possible because so many of these areas are like, no, we don't want that. And we're not going to cooperate. And so then it's like, okay, then outside officials have to come in, federal officials have to come in. Then they're very upset about that. But I think this plays into the politics of it because then optically it looks worse. Oh, look, this looks like authoritarians. And it shouldn't be that way. But as far as I'm concerned, this is because many of these local politicians that are driving the law enforcement decisions, they don't want these deportations. And so they want to make it look like an optical nightmare and have it cost a lot of money and drag their feet, hoping that inevitably the other side will give up or there'll be some sort of compromise that advantages them politically.
Well, this is the funny thing, and if I'm going to break like the neutral law character for a second and say that, like if you guys go and you watch the debate that Rob and I did on Gibbs's show about the fraud in Minnesota that Rob referenced earlier, think about that first. Just think about like what you're being asked to believe for a second. They're like, all right, step one, we don't like your immigration policy and we will not enforce it and we will not help you do it. And we will not help you do it even if someone's arrested for domestic violence, DUI, murder, bank robbery, like really heinous crimes. We're still not interested in helping you. We're not doing immigration enforcement, flat stop, get fucked, federal government. That's step one. Step two is we also won't investigate fraud if it seems to be done by certain communities who we're worried are going to be having a hard time during COVID. But if you make the inference that we have some kind of political agenda when you connect those two dots, you're obviously a horrifying racist monster. Because like, how could you see any connection between these two things? It's like at a certain point, you just could be like, well, just as a matter of common sense, like I don't know that I'm ever going to find a smoking gun of Tim Walz, growing a mustache and twirling it and laughing about this. But let's be honest about what's happening here. Like, I think we clearly know that there is a political agenda that unites and drives this sort of political malfeasance. It doesn't make sense otherwise.
And it's sad, again, to go back to that debate, like the accusations of racism, like we all have different levels of what we would think. Like Grid, probably most hardline, just like, nope, I don't want anyone from that community, whatever. And then it goes,
Grid went pretty hard,
right?
Grid
and then it goes
hard.
like to me, where I'm somewhere in between you and him. To you, your claim was quite simply this: you're like, these refugee policies are a bad idea, right? Mm-hmm. Instead, scrap that, and then just have like sort of, instead of immigration through sort of like a heart, like emotion, immigration through, well, what could benefit the United States? And so those are ways that we could have more robust tests. Legally, you're allowed to say, okay, we are certain benchmarks we say that you have to clear to become an immigrant here. The refugee status is different. That's sort of like an emergency thing, right? Like, oh, you're basically fleeing a dangerous situation. And so the bar for entering is much lower. And you're merely making the point like, look, the problem is that system. It's been abused. And so instead, take Somalians, right? Like, fine. I'm not saying we could never take Somalians. I'm just saying stop taking it in as a refugee status and let's bring in those that would be people that seem like they would be a better fit, that would benefit. And even that, for that position, they're like, well, you're racist. That makes you a racist. And it's like, what? How? Like, what is racist about that position? So I guess the non-racist position is we have to take every Somalian ever that wants to come in and we have no obligation to look at who they are. Is like, oh, does this person have a criminal rap sheet? Nope, that's racist to even suggest it. Just shut up and open the border. And it becomes frustrating because I think you could see the game. The game is that they're just trying to silence you and they're trying to make you look like a monster. And the truth is, I think both me and you would have said, let's stop this before it becomes a problem. Let's look at this refugee system in the first place and say, whoa, this is too expansive. Let's limit this. But instead, because we didn't, now we're in the unenviable position where it's like, we have all this fraud and the local government wasn't doing anything. So now the feds are looking at it and now it's becoming a big media story. And every step of the way, you're like, you only care about this because they're Somalian, because you're racist. And it's like, oh my goodness. It's just... It's so tiresome to have to jump through these hoops.
Oh, it's deeply tiresome. And when I get frustrated about it is when I debate somebody like Pisco, because like he and I get along. That's why I don't want to bag on him too hard. But like he'll do this thing where he'll say like, oh, well, you're a lawyer. Aren't you worried about due process? Which is kind of like the more gentlemanly version of the, right? Because like, he's not going to call me racist. But aren't you worried about due process? Aren't you worried about ICE overreach? Aren't you? And I was like, yeah, I am. Those are all things I worry about. To be honest with you, I worry about them a lot. But at the same time, if you're so worried about due process, wouldn't that prevent you from letting oceans of people across the border, knowing that due process will then create an unsolvable bureaucratic nightmare to start getting rid of the bad ones? Like, if you care about these rights and this process, you should be careful about who you bring in. You can't, like it's almost like you're a parent. Like it's like if you have kids and they open the fridge and they throw a bunch of eggs on the floor, they make a big mess, and now they go, You go, wait, you made a mess. You got to clean up. They go, that's not fair. It's not my chore day. And you're like, look, I understand that we have rules and chore days,
Right.
but you just made a giant mess. And now you're trying to use the rules to prevent me from holding you accountable and cleaning it up. And that's kind of how I feel about this, because we talk about connecting dots. In Minnesota, we have the Somali fraud, that ongoing story. We have the sanctuary city policies, and then we had that story come out about Biden got a memo that said his open border policies were going to cause chaos and a political nightmare, and he said, "Nope, doing it anyway." Right? So it's like it's very clear that this was a welcomed mess. It was a purposeful mess. And now, like to your point, if you point that out and you want to clean it up, people have a problem with that. And that irks me. I think that we have to have at least some ability to have a sane conversation about recognizing a problem and recognizing that a problem needs solutions.
Well, and I think with Bisco is a good example of Saul Alinsky, what is it, Rule 4, where it's if they have a rule, then exploit it, right? And the example Saul Alinsky goes is, if the legal rule is every inquiry has to be responded with by a letter, then make them send 10 million letters, because inevitably they won't be able to do it. And then you say, aha, you won't live up to your own rules. I remember months ago having a conversation with Pisco about the amount of deportations. If we are going to deport all illegals, and we went through a few numbers. How many do you think they are? What's the level of due process? What average time do you think each person should get to prepare their case in court, etc.? How long should the court hearings be on average? And so when we tallied it all up, I said, brass tacks, how long do you think it would take now if we never had one more illegal to get this process to deport almost all illegals, if that's what we chose to do? And I believe he said something like 24 years and trillions of dollars. That's what, in his estimation, it would take to afford the appropriate amount of due process. Now, the problem is, Bisco and people, he's just an example of someone that we both know, but there were people that may say that, and they may even sincerely believe this, but they were absolutely fine knowing that that border was open, and all these people were flooding in, and all the while they could have said, wait, whoa, what are you doing? No. Even if they thought these people should be left in, they should have been saying, look, the problem is, once we let them in, based on what our interpretation of due process would be, it'll be very arduous to get them out. And so when we're talking about taking in tens of millions, we have to be very careful, because, and the truth is, they didn't say that because, in my estimation, the truth is they want those people in, right? And so on one hand, that, their eyes are blind when they're flooding in. Huh? Well, I don't see anything. And then as soon as they lose power, and it's like, okay, now we have to fix your mess. They're like, that's ridiculous. To fix the mess, it'll require X, Y, Z. By the way, not something they're willing to be that concerned about due process when it comes to a lot of their political enemies. Awful lot of stories about some of the January 6th defendants receiving things that may be considered a lack of due process. Don't care. Doesn't matter. In general, wasn't that a bad event? Sure, you could find one or two examples. But when it's the opposite, when it's ICE deporting people, it's Kimar Brego Garcia, right? That's all that matters. And to this day, by the way, we didn't have that listed, but I mean, it seems like a judge just spoke here again, saying that basically he has to be set free.
I didn't follow that one. Do we know why the judge?
I didn't see. At this point, I'm just like, yeah, basically that's. So I didn't delve too deep into it. I figure that's something that we'll have plenty of time to talk about.
Oh, I'm sure. Though it is, since we're talking about Peace Code, I think the last time I talked to him about, like Kilmar and like those cases, like the high profile deportations, he took the position that I think it was for Garcia, not for Kilmar, actually, that the correct response would be for us to invade, to retrieve these deported people. It's like, that's kind of it's a perfect example of what you're saying, where it's like, so your view is that America's obligated to invade other countries to retrieve people that we don't want, but is under no obligation to prevent them from getting in the country in the first instance. That can't, like, just like, think about what the incentive structure you're arguing for is. Like that I mean, I'm sure he has some legal justification for it, but like, just on like a basic common sense level, that's an insane thing to say. Well, it's an insane thing to say.
He said that to me. He also said this. I forget the exact terminology he was using, but as you know, he had an order of deportation. It was just he had a withholding from El Salvador because a judge
Mhm.
ruled that he could be in danger in El Salvador. So accommodations could be made to send him to a third party country, right? And Pizca was like, one of the reasons that he felt that he couldn't be deported was that Garcia would have a claim of sort of his life would be in jeopardy because it had been a high profile case. So if he gets sent to El Salvador, people there will know, I know this case, right? And guess what? That's true of every country in the world we could send him to. So now he can't be deported anywhere because anywhere, if we send him to Iceland, well, could be a high profile case. And so he could be in jeopardy to go to Iceland or Japan or South Africa or Thailand or Vietnam. It doesn't matter. In Pisco's estimation, that is a defense why this gentleman could never be deported anywhere. Because clearly there's a target on his back by Trump. And so this gentleman doesn't know if he'd be safe. And I was like, but wouldn't he feel less safe in America where Trump's administration's running? No. And it's like you start to get the unreasonable nature of like you're intentionally setting a system up where it's like, well, we bring in millions of people, and then if you accidentally step on one rake, that's it. Stop everything. The whole system must end. And it's sort of a joke. And look, it's one thing for us. I'm not saying this to insult Bisco because I think me and you fall in the same category as him. We're not exactly movers and shakers like at the Supreme Court level or anything of that nature. I don't think any of us have that big of an ego that are saying that. But I do think this mentality permeates people in the halls of Congress and people that are making legal decisions, particularly coming from the left. They are intentionally setting up a system that allowed this to occur, and then they're going to make it as difficult as possible. And they're going to look, anytime you have mass law enforcement actions, there's going to be bad things that happen. You're going to have individual cops that act poorly. You're going to have decisions that were made that are mistakes or poor. And the problem is we now find ourselves in a situation where it's like, I don't want to see anyone's due process violated either. But what are we going to do? Just say like, well, let's take 2 years for each specific case just to make sure that every I's dotted and T's crossed. Oh, and by the way, there's 20 million. Good luck. I mean, we're never going to get any progress that way.
Well, this is a point that came up, and this is a wild tangent, so forgive me. But there's an interesting Supreme Court case called Slaughter, which is about whether the president can fire independent commissioners of regulatory agencies. And during the oral argument, I forgot which justice made the point. I think it was Gorsuch, but I don't want to swear to that. He's been on fire recently. He's had some great moments. But he basically, the justice made the point where he was saying, part of the problem with these independent agencies is it lets Congress and presidents off the hook because Congress and presidents don't want to make tough decisions and be held to account politically. So now they can say, oh, the agency did it, right? And that feeds into the game, right, that you're talking about, where it's like, well, we let all these people in. Well, what could I do? There was an agency and they made a decision and they have a rule and I'm just the president. And Congress is going like, well, we passed a law. Now the experts are deciding at the agency. We don't need to pass another law. Whereas when the agencies become mere instrumentalities, right? They have experts, but the political branches are the ones that are actually in control. And they listen to the experts, but our politicians make decisions. Then the buck stops somewhere. You say like, oh, you open up the border? Well, that's your fault. Because even if the agency head could have done something about it, you didn't fire him and you could have, right? And it's on you. And you see this play out now because like with Trump and Epstein, people rightly are saying, they're not giving Trump credit for Bondi being the one making the decision because they understand that the buck stops there. Right. And I think this is a thing we actually need more of in this country is direct political accountability. Like you open up the border, you lose the election. That's what happens next. Like there are certain decisions that you make that are very unpopular and you shouldn't be able to weasel out of it. The buck should stop with you.
So like on this note, this is a big issue that I've had. People talk to me a lot about where are we going wrong? Like I think this is outside the scope of legal matters, but forgive me a tangent here for a second. Congress sucks, regardless if Republicans or Democrats. They're very unpopular, both sides of it. Like, I don't know what Republicans are now. Democrats, I was reading 18% approval. 18%. Republicans aren't much better when it comes to Congress. And it's like, how can that be? How can it be that everybody hates them? Like 75% of the country, like Congress sucks. Doesn't matter if you're a Republican or Democrat, you hate it. And so when you like people talk about this and they're like, well, where's the problem? And for me, it seems like Congress, the legislative branches, it's basically worthless at this point. Like they're not doing the simplest things. So then where's the real power? I think the judicial branch has gotten a little too powerful, particularly now that Trump's in office with a lot of these like district judges. But to me, the problem's the executive branch, but it ain't the president. It's these agencies. That's where the real power is. And it's like, yeah, technically the president's at the head of them, but whether it be that just they don't give a shit, they're just going to do what they want. These executive agencies, like the FBI, might just be like, screw you, Trump, we don't care. We're going to do what we want. Or more to the point, it's sort of so huge and Byzantine, the president can't keep up with every little thing that's happening at every agency. And so I think that it is a huge problem, that's where so much of our power is in Washington now. You can change parties, but if the people in these agencies stay the same, you're not really getting a change in policy because they're going to continue to do this. A big case that came up, and this was obviously before we started our show. I forget the name of the case, but I believe they referenced it, called like Chevron deference.
Oh,
this was ruled on. Now, the layman, I was reading that this was a huge case against that, and that's one of my biggest priorities, too much power in the executive agencies like that. Basically, you tell me if I'm wrong about this, and maybe give us a crash course on this. The way it was this. You'd have an executive agency like maybe like the EPA, and there would be these broad laws that would be like the EPA has power over, over fishing policies. But then the EPA could make laws that were like microscopic on that. So they could say, we're allowed to rule that every fisherman in this area has to have an inspection, 3 times a week. And it's like, well, wait a minute. Congress never passed that law, but the Chevron deference said, well, in the scheme of the overarching authority that Congress gave this executive body, they're allowed to craft these sort of minute laws. And that's where the devil was. The devil's in those details, where all of a sudden these executive agencies are bloating how much power they have, because it's like, well, we have broad authority to regulate the environment. And so that gives us the authority to say, you have to pay us to inspect your fishing vessel. And that was overruled. And now the rule is that sort of these agencies can't do that. Can you talk a little about that case? And is my interpretation incorrect with that, or
this is one of the like as an originalist, when people ask like, oh, like when I get into struggle sessions with like erudite Pisco or whoever, and they're like, how could you possibly prefer the Trump administration to the Harris administration? This is the sort of thing I point out, because his Supreme Court picks have been unbelievably good, like just unbelievably good Supreme Court picks. So the case you're talking about is Loper Bright Enterprises v. Raimundo, and so the concept of Chevron deference was a long-standing tradition that basically ensconced power in the expert class, because what they said was, and Justice Jackson it still takes this point of view. She said it very loudly a few times recently at oral argument, that she thinks that Congress should be able to delegate to experts to rule the country if they want to, which I think is a nightmare, and I'm glad that we're chipping away at it now. But the idea was, let's say the EPA has a rule that says we can regulate pollution. That's what the law says. Then the EPA creates regulations that interpret the law. The law is very broad. So then they can just keep coming up with new rules, and the rules interpret the law. But then the question is, well, what if the agency gets it wrong? What if their rule has no bearing on the law? You go to court, you get a judge to ask. But under Chevron deference, the judge had to defer to the agency's understanding of their own law. So the agencies would say, well, in my expert opinion, noise pollution is a kind of pollution. And the judge would go, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I think when they said pollution, they really meant environmental pollution. But, I have to defer to you. So I guess you're right. I guess experts, noise pollution. And then the agency just gets more and more power. So without that, now you can go to court and say, noise pollution isn't a kind of pollution. That's ridiculous. And the judge goes, yeah, that is ridiculous. You're not allowed to do that. And they strike down the rule. So that really limits what agencies can do, which is fantastic. And then, to your point about the president not knowing what's happening, if Trump wins in the Slaughter case, which he almost certainly will, that gets rid of not all, but most of the agencies where Trump can't fire the head. Because that's how the president controls the agency, right? The president says, because you're right. He doesn't know what the line guys are doing. He can't tell who's doing the data entry. Like that's insane. But he can go to the head of the agency and say, why is this not working? and they say, "Oh, we'll fix it." He goes, "You got 10 days." 10 days later, still seems pretty bad. Pam, what's going on over there? And if it's not fixed, it's okay. You're fired. I'm going to get somebody else who'll do a better job. And that's how the president has control. The last point on all this, though, is you could end up with a president with too much power that way, right? Like if the agencies were designed by a Congress that thought there were going to be these bureaucratic experts running everything. If that's not true anymore, if we go back to 3 branches of government, of what our Constitution requires, and the president has control, the president might have too much control, at which point Congress needs to sack up and say, you know what, we're getting rid of the Department of Education. We know what, we're getting rid of this agency. We don't think the president should have that much control over the country. This was a bad idea. But I know this angers people who love the idea of having the country run by technocratic bureaucrats, but unaccountable experts is not a democracy. It's not even a constitutional republic. It is a anti-democratic, horrifying way to run a country. And Justice Scalia put it best. He said, it's a myth. There's no such thing as neutral expertise. The EPA, the experts at the EPA can use all their expertise and they can tell you whether the river is polluted. And they can tell you whether the factory caused the river to become polluted. But the decision about whether to shut down the factory and lose all the jobs and starve all the people, or to let the river get polluted and kill all the fish and ruin the fishing business downstream, that's a political decision. That has to be made by people who are accountable to the people, not by experts. And there's no way around that.
Yeah, and I couldn't have said it better. And that's exactly the point. At the end of the day, at least, look, you can say what you will about voting, this, that, and the other. At least there's a pretense of being able to hold politicians accountable at the ballot box, right? We don't have that, right? Like if Trump can't just make it real simple. Like if Trump can't get rid of the director of the FBI, if it's just like, nope, like the president has no say in whether or not that person's there for 10 years, regardless of who's president, right? Like then who's really running the show when it comes to legal matters? It ain't the president. And what can we do as people? We can shake our fist. Republicans and Democrats alike could come together and say, we want rid of James Comey. And they could just say, nope, sorry. No one has the authority to fire him. Only the agency itself or something like that. So it's an absolute nightmare. If Trump makes bad decisions and puts bad people, then you fire him by refusing to vote for his party the next time in the election. Same's true of Democrats. It's not a perfect system, but it's better than the alternative, where we have unelected bureaucrats where there's literally zero accountability.
And they stay forever. They're entrenched, right? And then they're protected by their expertise. And Justice Jackson made this in the Slaughter oral argument. She made this point. She said, like, well, why can't it be the case that Congress chose to delegate its power to experts who are, removed from the political process? And at the risk of correcting Justice Jackson, the best reason is that there's only 3 branches of government, not 4. Who has this power if it's not in any branch of government?
Right.
And they control everything. Like there's a government regulation for what counts as spaghetti. Like how wide can it be? You know what I mean? Like it's everything. It's down to like the most minute details of your life are run by these agencies. So if they're not politically accountable, then that's to me, that's just per se tyranny.
Reminder to everyone, if you have any specific questions, either on Ryan's chat or mine, put super chats in and we'll get to those questions in the last 20 minutes of the show. Real quick before we get to our next big topic, you did mention something there, talking about Duggan, when you talked about how it's almost impossible to hold judges accountable that are ruling from the bench. Mm-hmm. There has been this broad movement that you hear people making about people that are repeat offenders. For example, the guy that killed Irina and a bunch of others, and they'll murder someone and it's like, well, they were in and out of jail 37 times, brought up on 37 charges. And a lot of people are speaking on like, we should hold these judges accountable. They should be held criminally accountable if someone gets out. Can you talk about how That's the likelihood of that ever occurring, and
That's
whether or not it would be a good idea to do something like that.
Yeah, that's a 0% chance. I would call that. Like judges enjoy broad immunity for what they rule from the bench, just like Congress people have broad immunity when they're making laws for very good reason, right? You really don't want, because you really don't want one branch of the government bullying the other branch of the government with law enforcement. That's just not the way to do things. Now, if you don't like a judge, if you think a judge is doing a bad job on a state level, they can be impeached. In a lot of districts, they're elected, right? You don't even need to impeach them. Just win the election next time. Get a different judge, right? Federal judges have lifetime appointments. They would need to be impeached, and that's incredibly rare. But I don't think that's going anywhere, and I don't really think it should go anywhere. Like I think the idea of putting your thumb on the scale and saying that the judge can't make a reasoned decision and you're going to tell them what the reasoned decision is at the point of a gun is kind of a crazy thing to do. If you think the judge is bad at exercising judgment, the answer is obvious. Get a new judge, right? Like that's the issue, is that you're appointing bad judges. So look at that, like figure out why that's happening and fix that problem.
We don't want judges to be fearful if they truly feel that like there's a mistrial or for whatever reason in the sentencing, or if it's just sort of a non-jury trial. You don't want judges, just like you don't want jurists, to be fearful to say guilty or not guilty because personal blowback on themselves. That's not a way to get justice, because now you're not trying to evaluate the case and the merits of the case. You're like, how can I mitigate the risk to myself as much as possible? Well, this guy, if I let them off the hook this time, even though I think, listen, the evidence isn't there, or based on the statute that I'm looking at, I'm sorry, the prosecution didn't meet their burden. Now they are fearful, but if I let this guy out and he goes and commits another crime, I'm going to get punished for that. So I'm just going to say guilty just to hedge bets. We don't want that. That's a very bad system. I think the current system's not perfect, and I think there are a lot of problems with prosecutors and judges that are too soft on a lot of violent criminals, but that's not the answer to criminally hold them accountable. I agree with you. It should be impeachment or through voting, etc.
And let me give you an example of like how this is it's a very minor example compared to the crazy shit people are suggesting, where they like have judges who go to jail and that sort of thing. But when I was clerking, there was we were doing a criminal trial, and I was helping the judge oversee it. And one of the defense attorneys got into a scuffle with one of the prosecutors in the hallway and shoved him. Now, here's the thing. If you shove a federal officer in a courthouse, that's actually a federal crime. So we had to stop the whole trial, clear the jury out, because what the judge was worried about, he's like, look, how can I say that you're getting a constitutionally sufficient defense if your lawyer is worried that the prosecutor could bring the hammer down on him at any second? He could charge your lawyer with assaulting a federal officer, and if he doesn't, now he has leverage over your lawyer. So maybe even subconsciously, your lawyer's trying to curry favor with him and isn't being as aggressive as he would be. Like this is going to be a mistrial. We got to fix it. So we had to sit down, and the prosecutor had to say, like under oath, I'm not going to bring charges. It's like we waive it. It's gone. It's out of the case.
Right.
We're not going to do anything to cure the problem. And think about how minor that leverage is compared to saying, judge, if you find this person gets bail, we can throw you in jail. You know what I mean? Like the level of influence on the system there was so minor, and it was a huge deal. You know, what people are suggesting here is basically that mob justice, where they get to decide how the judge should rule, and that doesn't work. You know, again, if you hate the judge, if the judge is doing a bad job, you're not stuck with them. There's options. You know, get a new judge. There are political solutions to political problems.
Yeah, I totally agree. Next story, I want to make sure we get to this because it's going to be red meat. I think the audience will want to hear this. Epstein file stuff. Oh boy, still talking about the Epstein file. So,
good news, Rob. I heard it went off flawlessly. Trump met the deadline, and there's no redactions.
It's all,
we see everything.
We
know everything about Epstein
now.
Isn't it
We've
good?
moved on as a country. So, as we're aware, there was Congress passed legislation to release these files, and so there were deadlines that needed to be made. Trump's team ended up meeting some of those deadlines in the sense that they did release files. Problem is, They have not met the deadline of what they were supposed to release all of it. And there are significant redactions. And the spirit of the legislation seemed to suggest that redactions had to be incredibly limited, basically just to protect victims' identities and names. Trump's team's trying to say, like, look, we're working hard and trust us, bro. These redactions are just the victims and identifying features of them. I think that both of us would agree that that's probably garbage. Seeing the significant length of many of these redactions seems beyond credulity that this is literally just like 3 pages in a row redacted of this is Susie Smith and blah, blah, blah. It seems that there's more than that. So what are your feelings? Will there be contempt charges brought against the Trump administration? Do you expect any legal consequences beyond that for this redactions? And do you think that inevitably we'll see these in totality unredacted?
I mean, so let's start with the basics, right? Like under the Epstein Transparency Act, it's not even the spirit of the law. You're allowed to redact in the following 5 scenarios. There's victim information. It depicts some kind of, child sexual activity or other prohibited material. It would jeopardize an investigation, death, national security, that must, classified information, national defense, foreign policy, and are in fact classified, right? Not just it could. It is in those categories and is classified. And they're supposed to give a log that says, okay, on page 5, we redacted the line. That was in category 1. Okay, on page 7, we redacted the line. That's in category 2. So like, that's what they were supposed to do. I think anybody, you don't need a legal education to look at these documents and go, that's obviously not what they did. Right? They did blanket redactions. I do not, to my knowledge, they have not provided information. All they really gave us is pictures of Bill Clinton, which was funny, but also implies that they're not investigating Bill Clinton, right? Because they couldn't release it if it was subject, if it would jeopardize an investigation. So I guess we know Bill Clinton's in the clear. I mean, that's a little bit of a joke, but still not much of one.
Right.
So I think that I think the first step of this is like, did they comply with the law? Clearly not. They missed the deadline. They didn't produce everything on time. I don't think they produced any log of their redactions. And I think any sane person would look at their redactions and say, those are too much. You protected too much information.
I think that you're absolutely right. Now, I think particularly when it comes to these sorts of things involving investigations, criminal allegations, etc. There are a bunch of laws on the book, including Freedom of Information Act laws, etc. And we see this a lot with the FBI, missing deadlines over redactions, etc., etc. In fact, you hear a lot from these committee chairs. We requested this from the FBI. We requested this from the Department of Justice. By the way, this is under Republican and Democrat administrations. So unfortunately, it seems very common for these deadlines to be missed and for redactions to be against what the spirit of the law or the direct letter of the law is. The problem that's unique here is that this was specific legislation crafted for this specific issue. So this is more of a problem than just the broad Freedom of Information Act laws and things of that nature. And I think it's politically charged enough that it can hurt the Trump administration because it's not just Democrats that want this information. There are a lot of people in his side, in his base, that also want this information. And so once more, even if you take the legal consequences out of this, politically, it looks bad because it looks like you're intentionally not complying because you must have something to hide.
Look, we are a divided country. The only issue that everyone in the country agrees on is we'd like to put the Epstein issue to bed. I think everybody, there's very few issues with true moral consensus. This is one of them. Everybody would like to just know that the perpetrators have been found, that justice has been done, and that if there's no more leads to follow, then that's true. It could be that when all this shakes out, people are going to be like, yeah, obviously Trump, Clinton was taking a swim with Maxwell. Trump was on the plane, but none of that's a crime. That could be the end of the story, but nobody's going to trust that when you redact the entire document, right? Like there's going to need to be some transparency here. So I think politically, you're right. It's a bit of a disaster. And then continuing the political theme, if I'm going to put on like a partisan hat now, like I'm not trying to be fair. I'm trying to be like a Republican strategist. This wasn't it. Like what you needed was a hyper competent crew of like bloodthirsty mission driven lawyers who were going to go through here and they were going to do surgical redactions that would enhance your political narrative while having a story of compliance with the law that you can tell, right? Because like redacting the entire 119-page memo and then putting out a picture of Bill Clinton in a jacuzzi, that's kind of ham-fisted. It doesn't look like this was a real legal effort, right? I think that if you had, I think there was a way to have done this where they could have released the files and there would have been enough intrigue about the files that were released that we'd be talking about that and the investigations instead of Trump bungling a deadline. And they that should have been the goal, is to release this in a way that creates a narrative that's good for the administration. I don't know. I have no idea how this possibly benefits them.
Well, I mean, the only thing that you could say positively about the Trump administration's handling of this is just how bad the Democrats are. So, for example, there was a story I was reading the other day. It was not like a right way. It wasn't like Breitbart or something Newsmax. It was like CNN or Politico or something. And it was Epstein survivors furious at the Democratic Party because of the selective releases of things from the Epstein estate to try to smear Republicans. Now, there's questions as to have, is everyone who claims to be a victim? But let's table that for a moment and say, absolutely, there are victims. That we could all agree with, right? And you have to wonder, is anyone really have their best interests at heart? Or is this just pure rank political football where it's like both sides want to control these files and have selective drips that make themselves look as positive as possible and their opponents look as bad as possible? And as far as I'm concerned, both sides at this point look absurd. And it looks like everyone who has significant questions about the corruption of like our senior law enforcement, places like the FBI, and powerful people in our country and around the world involved in very shady stuff, they're coming away saying, yes, this basically confirms with what we thought, because they're refusing to allow us to, even when they're ordered through legislation, they refuse. Both sides are sort of still playing this game. So, yeah, I think that it's a bad look politically and for trust, particularly in Trump's, the institutions, but also I think the only thing keeping them afloat, the Democrats are just as bad. They're doing the same garbage with what limited access they have.
I think that, like, if this is maybe a little jaded, but look, the government's had these files for years. If they had some, amazing and both parties have had them. If they had some prosecution they could bring, like if there was a case against Bill Clinton, if there was a case against, I don't know, some high profile Republican, like if there was a case to be made, one of the parties would have done it by now.
Yep.
Like, are you saying that like the Biden administration, when they were, I'm sure as Pete would point out, a very hands off, like no thumb on the scale.
Sure.
Just do the investigation. They're like, let's look at the documents, let's look at the election, but let's not look at Trump and Epstein. That would be crazy. Like it would be untoward for us to bring a prosecution for his involvement. Like, obviously they looked at that. Of course you looked at that. Why wouldn't you? Right. And ditto when the Republicans were in power, when Trump was in power. Like if he thought he could have, like, he promised to throw Hillary Clinton in jail a few times. You don't think he asked, hey, Clinton in these Epstein files? I mean, I was on the plane. I saw him there. Like, they dropped me off in New York, then they flew to the island. So right. Probably he's in the files, right? Like, I mean, it's not like he has no knowledge base. We know he was on the plane. Like, we know he knows the guy. It's not like he is unaware of who's in the social circles. So, like, if there was a case to be brought, it stretches credulity that it wouldn't have been brought by now.
Well, unless
okay, here you go.
Unless both sides are in on it.
Yeah.
Then you don't want it, right? If it was Bill Clinton and Trump together committing some heinous crime, then, well, we don't want to push the issue because then we'll be implicated as well. I'm not saying that's what happened. I'm just saying that I think one of the reasons, for example, let's take a less heinous, but still a crime like insider trading. I think most people believe that both Republicans and Democrats have been involved with that,
Mhm.
but neither side wants to go after the other because they know people on their own side are going to be caught up. So instead, they're just like, well, we're just going to pretend this isn't happening because, and it's going to take someone that's, at least seen as outside that scope, like a Thomas Massey, right? That's pushing this because Thomas is like, that ain't me. I ain't involved in this. I say let all the heads roll, Republicans or Democrat. Or the other example is if it's tied up in US or foreign intel, where it's like, well, now it's a bigger issue. Sure, maybe we got, State Senator Jim Smith over there. However, it would also implicate the FBI or the
Mhm.
CIA. And so is that worth unraveling? Uh, I would say, I'd go even further. I say if there was incriminating evidence to that level, and we're talking about Epstein first being brought up on charges in 2008, I mean, we already see a propensity for the FBI to put things in burn bags. You think they've kept super incriminating evidence for 18 years? Just sitting around, knowing at any point an administration that disagrees with them could be like, oh my goodness, look at what we found in these files. I think what we're most likely to see is a bunch of innuendo that wouldn't result in crimes. It's going to be like you said, it's going to be so and so was on the plane,
Mhm.
so and so was at the party, but we don't have evidence of crimes. And there's going to be a lot of pressure from those people that might be named, and maybe they didn't do anything, but they ain't going to want their name released, right? Because let's assume for a second that I'm on that list and I didn't do anything. Do I want my name publicly released? Of course not. It would still tarnish me, even though I did nothing wrong. So I think that that's what's going on. That there is at this point, if there ever was evidence of crimes, that at this point it's not there, and that there are powerful people that, even though that what Trump's team's looking at right now doesn't have evidence of them being
Mhm.
crimes, it would look bad for them socially. And so there may be a little carrot and stick. We'll fight this legally, plus here's some campaign donations. Let's keep that out of the public eye. I think that's the most likely scenario of what's going on.
And in terms of the buck stops here, and this is, I think, like, first of all, Thomas Massey just looks like an American hero these days. Like, I mean, this is why Trump was saying like, oh, I'm gonna primary you, and people who like know Kentucky were like, good luck with that. Good luck, have fun.
I mean, they have Rand Paul as well. I mean,
yeah, but like that's, I mean, he looks like $1 million right now because he looks like he actually has integrity on this, and no one else does. To your point, but yeah, in terms of the buck stops here, you signed a law. You signed a law that said we're going to release this, and one of the things the law says is we're not going to take personal embarrassment into account, right? So, like, yeah, I bet it's personally embarrassing, but you signed a law that said that, so now you're kind of stuck in this mess, because that's where we are right now. I do think, though, and this is something we were talking about earlier, one of the flaws, I don't know if it was purposeful, it might have been, it might be a purpose, not a bug, right? This could have been how it's designed. The law doesn't have any enforcement mechanism, right? It says you shall do this. Okay, or what? Right? Like, imagine imagine you were in like your town, right? And they pass a zoning law and it says all houses shall be painted gray. And you're like, well, what happens if I don't paint it gray? And they're like, oh, we don't know.
We'll yell.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
But it's like, oh, well, then maybe I'll just ignore that. And they're like, oh, well, if you ignore that, we might start court proceedings. It's like, oh, well, what's going to happen then? It's like, well, in 5 or 10 years, maybe nothing. We'll see. You're like, okay, I guess I'm going to paint my house white then, because I don't really, So because there's no enforcement mechanism here, the only real options are to bring a contempt proceeding in court. Congress has inherent contempt powers, so they could try to hold Miss Bondi in contempt. And that could be, force her to comply. Or you can go to court and you can ask for something called a writ of mandamus, which is a fancy way of saying an order from a court to a federal officer that says you must do the following. And then if they don't, then they're violating the court's order. But those things are very slow. Those things take a long time. Like getting Congress together to get a contempt proceeding and like wrangle the votes, going to court, winning a court case. These things take time. I don't think they're reasonably going to hurry the Trump administration up. So I think Trump, to that extent, they're going to slow play this. They'll miss the deadline. They'll trickle it out. And I'm not sure that there's much that can be done about that.
Mad says here, if your president had 5 prominent foreign leaders in your pocket from the Epstein files, would you publish or extract maximum advantage for the USA? Well, listen, what we would do from a political calculus is different than a legal discussion of it and what legally they should do. But to that extent, I'll simply say this. Can I come up with hypothetical situations for why it would be better for the country for Trump to not release this? Sure. Like, for example, let's just say hypothetically that Benjamin Netanyahu and Vladimir Putin and Zelensky and the leader of Hamas are all in these files. And Trump could go and say, war ends today, or these names get released. Would it be for the greater human good, hypothetically, in that situation, if it ended these wars? Maybe, but I'm not going to give that benefit of the doubt. I wouldn't do it for a Biden administration. I'm not going to do it for a Trump administration. And then there's moral, depending on what we're exactly talking about, what these files show. I mean, is there any moral good worth covering up assaults on children? I mean, I don't know. So I guess the easiest way to get out of that question for me is the legal standard wouldn't matter there. You still have to comply legally, like from the eye of the law. And I'm not going to give the benefit that, yes, you can hypothetically say there's good reasons to do all sorts of immoral or unlawful things, but I wouldn't give that a benefit of the doubt to someone I didn't vote for. So I'm not going to give it the benefit of the doubt to the Trump administration now, is how I look at that.
But also, let's imagine that's true for a second, right? And this is going back to my point about having like the lawyers a little sharper. Let's imagine one of the flight logs says like, in June 14th, flew to Moscow and picked up Vladimir Putin, right? Like, I mean, that would be fucking big news, right? Instead of redacting the whole log, let's say you want to pressure Vladimir Putin, right? You leave open on June, you redact the date. So on redacted date, flew to Moscow, redacted, right? Well, now when you go up to Vladimir, you're like, hey man, hey Vladdy, you don't want this coming out, right? Well, I'm just showing you that this might come out. So, you could leverage it politically while still redacting less, right? So like, that's what I mean. Like you could be, even in the scenario your caller was describing, where there's this kind of like foreign policy reason to try to hold stuff back, you could be surgical and tactical and kind of, mean-spirited and play it out and play it sharp is, I guess, what I'm saying. This seems ham-fisted to me, which is the most disappointing outcome. Like you don't get transparency, but you also don't get the sense that movers and shakers are using it to any operational advantage.
Yeah, and listen, I see someone saying there's arguments that maybe there just wasn't enough time. Maybe these files were redacted through previous administrations, and the Trump administration was finding a difficult time going through the volume to comply in a timely manner, and so maybe they will voluntarily release things less redacted. All of that's hypothetically true. I'm just saying that I'm trying to hold this to the standard that I would hold if it was an administration that I didn't vote for. And, so there is any number of, well, wait a minute, it's not as bad as it at first seems. If you knew the full picture, then maybe you'd say, okay, there's any number of things that we could say that. But given the information we have now, I think it's fair to say that it's been a huge disappointment as far as I'm concerned.
And also, that's like a budget issue, right? Like you say they don't have enough time. Okay, maybe they don't have enough money. They had enough time. I can tell you that, like in my career, I once was asked to head a team that redacted and released 5 million documents in 6 weeks. Right? Like, did I sleep very much? No. Did we have to spend a lot of money to hire an army of attorneys to do this work and like have like, basically we set up like $1 million corporation overnight where we just had like levels and levels and levels of law firms working on this. Absolutely. Like we spent a lot of money, but it was many times the volume of the Epstein files and we had way less time. So like law firms do this. This is a thing that we do. It's expensive. That's one issue, but time, no, they could, if they wanted to prioritize it and they were willing to put the resources into it, they could have done it.
Yeah. Now we will get to audience questions. So remember, get super chats in on either Ryan or mine's channel. The other case that we wanted to talk about was you had mentioned the Heritage Foundation had released more information on their arguments on birthright citizenship. Now we talked about this last week. But how have your thoughts changed? So you sort of gave the case for what the best case for saying birthright citizenship is going to be changed by what that means, and then gave the case for why you think that it's going to remain the same, what both sides' arguments will be. Where do you feel now, post reading sort of what the Heritage Foundation has said?
So last time we talked, I told you I started at 80-20 Trump loses. Then I read Trump's briefs and I went down to like 60-40 Trump loses. I don't know how carefully they're going to use the Heritage Foundation stuff. And I think hopefully the Heritage Foundation files an amicus brief. But looking at the stuff that I was reviewing yesterday on stream, I think it's more likely that he wins now. Like these are good arguments. And not only are they good arguments, they're originalist arguments. These are arguments that are based in the history, like deep, deep, deep analysis of the history of what was happening in 1868, immediately before, immediately after, and designed to appeal to Justice Gorsuch, to Justice Barrett, to the originalists on the court. So this is a targeted effort to create a majority on the court by the Heritage Foundation. And I think they did a damn good job. They raised some historical facts that I just did not know. So like, just to give you one example of something I found really interesting. The question, for those of you who haven't been following this that closely, birthright citizenship comes from the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment says that, you know, if you're born here and you are subject to the jurisdiction, then you are a citizen. So the whole question right now is not, do we get rid of birthright citizenship? Everyone wants to keep birthright citizenship. Nobody thinks that if you're a citizen, that your kids shouldn't be citizens. Like everyone wants birthright citizenship. The question is, what does subject to the jurisdiction thereof mean, right? Well, she raised this point, which I thought was fascinating. Right before the 14th Amendment, we had the Civil War. Okay, well, why does that matter? Well, during the Civil War, there were Europeans who were living in America. They were permanent. They were immigrants, right? They're permanently living here, but they're not citizens, right? Well, now we have a civil war. There's a draft. Well, are you subject to the jurisdiction of America completely? Or are you going to come up and say, oh, I know that I was living here and I know that I enjoy living here, but it turns out now that you have a draft, I'm French and you can't draft me. I don't want to fight and die. I'm not that American, right? So how do they decide this? Well, that Congress said, well, at this time, you could write something called a Declaration of Intent. And the Declaration of Intent says, yes, I'm a foreigner, but I intend to live in America. I intend to become a citizen of America. I subject myself fully to the jurisdiction of America. And then you could be drafted. So wouldn't the people who wrote the 14th Amendment have had that in their mind? It happened just a few years before, right? That's what they meant by jurisdiction. So she lays out a compelling set of examples like that to say that, like, whatever we might look at this language today, yes, to me, I'll candidly admit, subject to the jurisdiction, to me, reading it as in 2025, that seems like really broad language, but that's not how people understood it at the time. And the question for an originalist is, what do we make of it at the time? So I think this evidence was compelling, really compelling historical evidence. And I think it's going to appeal to at least 3 or 4 justices on the court.
It's very interesting. And I know we talked about this a lot the last time we did the show, but what you're explaining here is as follows. And this is what I think a lot of people might get lost in the shuffle here. In order to correctly predict, or in order to attempt to predict how a case is going to be viewed, it's not enough to just say, well, through my lens, this is what I believe. What you're doing is you're trying to look at the justices and say, okay, how do you get 5 justices at least to rule on either side of this? Where are they coming from through how they look at the law? And one of the things we talked about was, you were like, look, in order to get 5, you're going to have to appeal to sort of an originalist intent. So, for example, I, as someone who's not a lawyer or someone who's a legal scholar, I may say something like this. Look, clearly the people that wrote the 14th Amendment weren't viewing a future where we would have birth tourism, where it'd be so easy to travel around the world that someone could land in an airport, have a baby 3 days later and say, okay, that baby's an American citizen. Clearly that wasn't what they intended. And you rightfully say, but that's not the point. The point is, what did they mean when it was written? What was the originalist intent? Not, well, would it be better from a policy prescription now to be like, well, it's too much? we think that that should be carved out. The idea of birth tourism should be carved out. All that will matter to these justices that'll be necessary to overrule is what was the originalist intent to this. And so those terms and what they meant at the time is going to be, subject to the jurisdiction thereof. That's going to be what the tipping point is going to be to decide whether or not you can at least get 5 justices. And, examples we've given previously, because I think, just to catch everyone up real fast, that phrase had to be added there for some reason. So the exact wording is all persons born or naturalized in the United States, comma, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. And you point out they're not just going to add extra language for the sake of it. For example, if they literally meant just everyone born here is a citizen, they would not have added the and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. So the debate will become, well, why was that part added? It has to be something, we're not saying that literally every single person here, and one of the caveats that the side that's going to want to keep the system the way it is they're going to say, well, this is referring to things like diplomats. So, for example, if the ambassador from France comes over with his wife and she has a child while she's over here, that's not a citizen because he's not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States as a French politician, and here's a French ambassador. Now, what you're making here is the argument saying, yes, but no, it's more expansive. It could have been more expansive. It wasn't just those small little caveats. It was something bigger. And in the case you give there, I think is very interesting of, do you declare your intent so that you would be eligible for a draft? And I think that is an excellent argument.
Well, I mean, look at, first of all, you're 100% right. Like I've worked on Supreme Court briefs before. And when you do Supreme Court briefs to talk about, how hyper-focused you get on the justices, one of the things you get is you get amici, you get like friends of the court to write briefs to support you. And what you do is you assign them. You're like, we need a brief that Justice Kagan's going to like. She's not going to like our argument. Who can we find who's going to write an amicus brief that Kagan's going to like? So that's what's happening here. The Heritage Foundation is putting together what I would call the Gorsuch-Barrett brief. They're writing for and I speak Justice Barrett because she's a Scalia clerk and that's her. I'm a Scalia enthusiast. That's kind of, we have the same jurisprudential philosophy. So that's kind of where my head is at. And this argument, just to give you a few more details, because you're right, nobody thought about birth tourism at the time, but in 1890-ish, so after the 14th Amendment was passed, there was no national policy on immigration. It was all case by case, right? It was all ad hoc. There was a woman, I think her last name was Devereaux, but I'm not 100% sure about this. She's Irish. She was on a boat and she was trying to get access to the United States through New York, but she was pregnant. Access was denied, but they're not monsters. They brought her to a New York hospital to have the baby. And while she had the baby, the Secretary of State's like, well, you can't, we're not letting you in. You're not going to be a citizen. Sorry, go back to Ireland. And it was, case by case. And then she goes, well, the 14th Amendment, my son was born here. And the Secretary of State said, yeah, too bad, kick rocks, and sent them both back to Ireland. So clearly, a few years after the 14th Amendment was passed, the executive branch didn't believe that it created birth tourism, right? There's historic examples of them denying it. So if it didn't mean that then, why does it mean it today? Yeah. What changed? And what changed is people started believing it meant that. But to an originalist, what people believed doesn't matter. What people, in the general sense, what matters is what they believed at the time. And at the time, they turned this woman away, even with her child. They sent the child back to Ireland. This is the sort of this woman the lawyer's name is Amy Swearer at the Heritage Foundation, and that she's been compiling. She wrote a law review article. She's been giving interviews. It's really compelling stuff. I think that there's a very good chance that Trump's going to be able to ride this to victory. That's
great news. Now, just to be clear, this would not affect anyone who was a citizen who has a child in the United States.
No.
I don't think anyone's even arguing that, nor would this affect it even if they were arguing that, this limited interpretation that you're talking about.
Yeah, the only categories that Trump's executive order targets are people who are here temporarily and have a child with somebody else who's not a lawful citizen, or people who are here illegally and have a child not with a citizen. If you have a child with a citizen, there's birthright citizenship.
Yeah.
It's really just those two categories. It's also, by the way, forward looking. It only applies, I think, starting in February going forward. So if you had a child, 5 years ago illegally, you still, no one's going to say, oh, we're going to take away your citizenship retroactively, right? So it is a forward-looking policy and a limited policy in that sense.
Yeah. One question from over in your channel, Chapping Bro says, Rob, were the people who didn't submit their declaration of intent but not citizens illegals? No. Like you know more about this specifically than me, but during the Civil War, you're a French citizen, you're long-term living in the South or the North, whatever, and then there's a draft and you're like, whoa, I'm not a US citizen. That wouldn't make you an illegal. You're just a guest, right? Like basically you would be like on a temporary visa, even if you were long-term, but that doesn't mean you're illegal.
Well, the thing is, the idea of like restrictive national immigration policy kind of started later, is the thing. Like prior to the 1890s, immigration policy was really handled at the state level primarily. And sometimes the Secretary of State would weigh in, but it was all very ad hoc. So there wasn't like a sweeping law until like the Chinese Exclusion Acts later on. So the idea that someone would be here and be an illegal kind of almost didn't make sense, right? Like maybe, okay, you went to a state and they said, we don't want you, we banish you, and then you sneak back in. Well, now you're a criminal because they banished you. But generally speaking, that concept didn't exist yet. You're a Frenchman, you're here. You're living in America, but you're French and you don't want to fight in the Civil War. Like you didn't have to, there was no visa, right? For that you were ducking to get in. It was just, the system was a little bit less developed. And that makes sense because, it took like 3 months and you had a 50-50 chance of dying to get across. Like getting here was not that easy. So it wasn't exactly the state of affairs you have now where people show up at the border constantly, and it's the blood, sweat, and tears and money investments are quite a lot lower.
Yeah, it's definitely the case. And I do think that there's, even today, right, like there's some confusion on the different statuses and sort of what that entails for you. So there are just people that are straight up illegal. Then there are lawful visa holders that overstay that we consider illegal. Then there are people that are here on temporary visas of all sorts of kinds. Then there are people that are here under refugee programs. So each of these entails sort of different levels of, well, what would due process mean? What are their rights that they have? And I think it gets very confusing to people. And so, yes, it's important to differentiate when it comes to a legal matter of what's being discussed here specifically.
Now, I do think one thing that's important, especially on a show like this, because I know your audience loves your debates, the legal side of this, I'm going to develop this, and there's going to be other people that are going to be making the arguments legally. But the flip side of this is the policy arguments. And that's going to be what you hear more often in like a newsroom, right? Not less than the legal arguments. And one thing that's been bothering me is that people talk about constitutional rights the wrong way. They'll say things like, well, how dare you want to limit birthright citizenship? That's a constitutional right. And saying, no, that's not the right way of looking at it. The constitutional rights limit democracy. They take things away from democracy. You're saying that the people don't get to decide immigration policy because the Constitution says they don't get to decide. Okay, if that's true, I support the Constitution. If that's true, if that's actually what it says, if that's actually what it means, then I agree with you. But that's what we're debating. We're debating what it does mean. So, I shouldn't have to give you a more generous interpretation that actually is anti-democratic and reduces the things that people can decide as a matter of moral principle, right? And the rule should be that unless we're sure the Constitution took the right away, the people get to decide, right?
Yeah.
And if the Constitution did take the right away, then the people don't get to decide. Fair enough. That's the rule. But there's a moral high horse that people are riding. They ride high on the idea that like, oh, if we give a right, it's a good thing. Not necessarily, right?
Yeah, and
it's a very bad thing.
That's right. And it's like, it's also very selective on what we decide rights are and who gets them and things of that nature. So yeah, I totally agree. There is this sort of like moral proclamation, more rights good, more rights for more people, and it's like, well, you could get yourself into a lot of trouble with that sort of mentality.
Well, there's a really funny example in like I forgot the year. It's like 1920s ish. The Supreme Court was they weren't originalists. They were like living constitutionalists, but they were conservative, right? So they weren't like they weren't like the rights for liberals crowd. So states tried to make minimum wage laws, and they tried to make laws outlawing child labor. And the Supreme Court said, no, 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 no. The Constitution gives you a right to freedom of contract. Minimum wage laws and child labor laws are unconstitutional. All of God's children have the right to agree to whatever contracts they want. And it's like, well, if you wanted a minimum wage law, that right seems to be getting in the way, because the court's saying the government doesn't have any right to control in this area, that people can't vote on it. Maybe you don't like that right. Maybe you would prefer that people only give the rights that are expressly in the Constitution, and that we limit them to exactly what was meant and understood in the language that was used at the time, rather than interpreting them expansively.
Yeah, that very well put. I know that recently you talked. Was it last night you were talking with Pisco? You talked.
He bailed.
Really?
Sorry. Hold on. Let me be measured.
Did you guys talk at all?
No, we agreed to a time. He got sucked into he got one guide by somebody in his chat and just bailed. Now, maybe that's because he didn't want the smoke. I'm not saying that, but you can draw your own conclusions.
Yeah, I was excited. I wanted to watch it, and then when I'm at my in-laws, my internet's very spotty. They sort of live in the woods. So I saw that you were going to be debating him, and then I was like, well, I'll watch that sometime down the road. And so I'm sorry to hear that it didn't. I did talk to him on my 24-hour show.
I saw some of that. You guys did like 5 fucking hours. I'm not watching that whole thing.
Yes, it was. I think that we talked some of the stuff that we had talked about, like the Venezuelan. We spent a lot of time on that. I don't know how much more there is to potentially. Criminal Sean came on as well. I'm up in the air about that case. I think that there's a better case to be made as far as I'm concerned. That the first sort of objection, which is targeting these cartel boats in the first place, is something that is illegal. It shouldn't be allowed because it's not the same as like an enemy combatant. The order to combat, the more I look into it, I'm just not persuaded. I just think that it's going to be too broad of what we allow, particularly if once we accept that this boat and the drugs on it are a legitimate target, it seems too much at that point to say, well, just because an enemy combatant would have been attached to it, that we couldn't strike back. Did you have any changing beliefs on that since last we've talked?
No, and I think Pisco actually he did a less debate show than this guy Avi, who's specializes in international law, and I think if he wasn't in debate mode, he would admit that the odds of there ever being a prosecution of this are essentially zero, and the odds of there being, I think if you put a gun to his head and you said like, would it be reasonable for a soldier to refuse this order because it's illegal? He would have to say no.
Right.
Because like the orders to combat thing is a separate thing. And I actually agree with you about that. But in terms of the broader question, like, was this an authorized use of force? Because like, if it's not authorized, then it's just, maybe murder or whatever. But like, was this an authorized military action? That's one of the grayest, murkiest areas in all of U.S. constitutional law. Like, I challenge your chat to go find the congressional authorization for the Korean War.
Right.
Go find it.
Yep.
It doesn't exist. Congress never authorized the Korean War. We were there, boots on the ground. It was kind of a big deal. So, like, I don't think there was any congressional authorization for when Clinton was bombing Libya, and yes, Obama had authorization to go after the people who did 9/11 based off the authorization that was given to Bush, but he also went after ISIS. ISIS was founded post 9/11.
And that's the problem. The AUMF, it could be interpreted so broadly. And this was part of the argument I was making to him. Now, listen, I'm someone who ultimately is like, yes, this is too broad. I would love to see it reined in. I'm just saying the way that it's been used and interpreted. The AUMF, for example, says that presidents are allowed to make military strikes against, I forget the exact wording, but like groups that financially are offering assistance to the groups that carried out 9/11. And so all Trump's team would have to say is, we think that these cartels share drugs and money with Islamic terrorists.
Yeah.
And there you go. Now it's
well,
justified under the AUMF. I don't have to like it. I think that I would like to see Congress step back into their role and saying, look, before you, to me, the interpretation was there's an attack imminent. Not, well, there's sort of terrorist operations around the world and the president's just going to strike. I don't like that. But that's the way it's been interpreted, and that's the way it's been done my entire adult life.
Well, this is, I think Pisco is unfair. I don't want to say disingenuous, but unfair, because he's someone that says, like, people bring up Obama just to make a hypocrisy argument. I'm not making a hypocrisy argument. The argument I'm making is that Obama, there's no dispute, he exceeded the authorization of military force. Some of the people he drone struck were not related to 9/11. They were related to terrorism more broadly, right? ISIS was not responsible for 9/11. Flat stop. How did he authorize? What was his legal justification for that? He said, U.S. has a right to self-defense. The president has inherent powers as the commander in chief. And to your point where you said, well, wait a minute, they're not attacking you. They're not like in a plane coming to America. They're at a wedding. Where's the imminence? He said, well, we know where they are today, but we won't know where they are tomorrow. And so if we don't strike them now, there's going to be imminence in the future. It could be a year from now, but we won't have another chance. So they broadened imminence to be this huge category. And if you apply that to the boats, it's very similar. They're bringing over fentanyl, which kills all these people. The president actually just declared it a weapon of mass destruction for whatever that's worth. They're going from Venezuela to other ports. Where they get to the other ports, they're going to break it down and they're going to put it in smaller drug boats and try to breach through U.S. security to get into our harbors. They're not going to come in with the fucking giant speedboat with the obvious drug barrels and be like high Coast Guard, right? They're going to break it down. So we strike the boat now because we know where the boat is now. And before it gets spread into a million small containers and poisons Americans. It's a very similar argument. Right? Is it broader than what Obama did? In some ways. In some ways, it's narrower. But like, if one is fine, saying the other is clearly illegal strikes me as absurd. Like, well, this is
you're right. It's not what you're arguing here isn't an argument from hypocrisy. It's an argument from legal precedent. Right? Like, it's if this is the way it has been, then when we see that same justification applied today, the hypocrisy would be this, which isn't the argument you're making, but I could say, if you didn't have a problem and didn't raise objections and didn't even raise an eyebrow when Obama or Bush or Biden exceeded this, and now you're raising your objection now, it seems that your objection is probably more politically oriented. Having said that, there were civil libertarians that raised objections the entire time. I myself was a person that was like, I don't like the fact Congress is supposed to be. So in that vein, if we would say, look, Trump, you can't do this. And also retroactively looking, it should have been the case that this wasn't occurring under Obama. It wasn't occurring under Bush. I would say fine. I only bring up that, like, the people that were fine with it then or not now are merely basically saying, because I like the guy that was making those decisions back then. So I trust him. I trust that he had good reason, but I don't trust Trump. And therefore I think Trump's reasons are nefarious. And it's like, if you're going to accept the legal justifications for what we saw under Obama, it's difficult to all of a sudden say that those same sorts of arguments shouldn't apply now.
And look, if we're gonna put aside politics for a second and just be like honest about what's happening, let's be clear. The rules of war and the process of declaring war they're bygones of an era where war was formal. Two countries would sit down and say, we're going to fight on Tuesday. Let's go to the field. And the redcoats have the X's on their uniforms and there's no guerrilla fighting, right? Today, we're being attacked, and this was the issue with 9/11. This is the issue with terrorism generally, by quasi-military groups that organize. Are they affiliated with the state? It's kind of hard to prove. The cartels certainly have Venezuela's backing, but are they really an arm of Venezuela? Who knows? And they attack you in an irregular way, right? So what every president Clinton, Obama, Bush, Biden, Trump, all of them have been grappling with is I need to defend the country, but the powers I have, it's not really clear whether or not they allow me to do this. So my choice is, do I say, you know what? I don't want to push the envelope, so I'm just going to let them into the country and see what happens. Or am I going to say, you know what? It's a gray area. I'm the president. I'm going to defend the country the best way I know how. And because of that, the gray area keeps getting wider. The only real solution is to have some kind of congressional solve, but we're nowhere close to that.
Right. That's exactly it. The other issue that came up with me in Fisco's debate that I think this is the sort of shit with him. And again, I use him as a proxy. He's just someone that, is involved in the legal field who I have access to. Very upset with what he sees as Trump's politically motivated prosecutions of people like James Comey. Right. And he quite, it would be absurd, says him, to have politically motivated prosecutions. And then when I bring up well, let's look at some of the cases against Trump, he is like, absolutely none of the cases against Trump had politics anything to do with them. And it's that sort of like absurdity, right? Where it's this plausible deniability because he knows if he says, well, of course, they were targeting Trump because he was Trump and it was election season. But I also think there's meat on the bones of these cases. He can't say that, right? Because if he says that, then you could say, okay, it was the same with James Comey or the same with John Bolton or the same with, right? And so he has to be like, no, it is fundamentally illegal to have political considerations be any part of the investigation. And it's absolutely infuriating to me to listen to people that have any sort of legal. I even said, I was like, look, there are people on the left that admit, yeah, a lot of these, like some of these cases, not all, but some of these were politically motivated against Trump. And he specifically says, what, like fake centrist Ryan? Like him, he's the one that says these are politically motivated. But is it not true that there are, like, you could see him on CNN that'll be like, yeah, okay, the Alvin Bragg case, the sort of the Mar-a-Lago case, these seem to be political. Well, that's why they went after.
Again, let's just be honest for a second here, right? Like someone like Pisco makes a big deal about the norm of the independence of the DOJ, right? They'll be like, President, hands off. No, I'm not going to do anything. No matter if if Eric Holder says that I'm Obama's wingman, no, hands off. The thing that I think we need to start being honest about is that there was never really independence, right? The president could fire the attorney general anytime he wanted for any reason, right? So how much independence is there really? There's as much independence as the president wants there to be. So why would the president want independence? It's so that he's not accountable for the decisions the DOJ makes. It's a political dodge, right? Like, let's imagine that Bernie Sanders was elected president. And, he's been campaigning, these vicious Wall Street bastards, they're stealing from you, these oligarchs, these horrible monsters, blah, 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 right? He gets in office. And it turns out the week he's elected, he's just proven right. He's just proven absolutely right. Musk and Bill Gates and BlackRock are all exposed for committing these horrible financial crimes. There's a big story in the Wall Street Journal. They're ripping off the American people. It's this huge, huge deal, right? It turns out the oligarchs were evil all along. President Sanders calls his attorney general and says, hey, I want you to look into this. And his lawyer goes, oh, no, Mr. President. You can't tell the attorney general.
That's political, right?
That's political. Like, it's absurd. Of course, the president would make that call. And of course, the attorney general would say, yes, sir. And of course, that's happened in every administration. Do I know how expressed Biden was about saying, look into Trump? I don't know. But the norm is there to protect the president, not to actually create true independence, because there is no true independence.
And this is, we have Agent Smith says, Trump goes after people for the pettiest things. People do it back and he plays the victim. Spare me up. Well, here's the issue. Certainly Trump ran in 2016 on lock her up. But what did he do? Right? The Trump team did very little. In fact, to my knowledge, I don't know Trump's administration, his DOJ, or for that matter, even Republican attorney generals in the states. I'm unaware of them going after prominent Democrats in this way at all. Conversely, Trump, they went after over and over, and it was the way that they went after. I'm willing to accept the Georgia case as at least being a crime worthy of okay, regardless if you think Trump committed that crime or not, it rises to the level of like, this is serious. The Alvin Bragg stuff, that's a joke. The overvaluing Mar-a-Lago, to break the glass ceiling on prosecuting, one administration prosecuting a former president over such flimsy stuff that was clearly politically motivated is absurd. But to further answer the question, you're making my point for me, Agent Smith. I don't want to hear any of you clutch at pearls if Trump's team goes after opponents now when you're like, well, it was okay because Trump's petty, so it was okay to go after him. Fine. The standard's been set. Now the standard is you pardon everyone on your way out the door and you go after your opponent as aggressively as possible. Fine. I'm willing to accept that that's the world you guys wanted. You started it. That's what you all started to do. Fine. Let her roll, right? And so don't say like, oh, this happened to Trump and now he's playing the victim. I don't care anything about that. You're right, whatever. Say whatever you want. Prosecutions, baby, that's what I want. Start going after political opponents. You guys were fine with it. I'm fine with it too. I just don't have the pretense that you guys try to put on, oh, this was never about politics. Bullshit. Well, you know it's true. Pisco knows it's true. All the lefties know. That's why they were going after Trump with all these cases. It was political. And to sit there and pretend like, no, it's not, is absurd.
And this is what I mean about like the veneer of independence, right? Because sometimes, I forgot who made this point. I think it might have been Scalia, but Gorsuch made it recently, where they appoint a special prosecutor, right? And they say, oh, well, now it's not political because the prosecutor is going to decide. It's not the president, right? I'm delegating it. Okay, but like, let's say you want the prosecutor to investigate, some crime committed by a Republican. You appoint a prosecutor who hates Republicans, like the most political animal you can find. Let's say you want the prosecutor to not prosecute the Republican. Maybe you find somebody who's a little bit more even-minded, a little bit more sympathetic, who's more of a nice guy, right? Like the game is that you create this illusion of non-control with these mechanisms, and then you can kind of artfully fill the seats to create the outcome you want without having visibly had your thumb on the scale. And one thing I like about the Trump administration is that I know it's his fault when something goes wrong. Like when the Epstein files are fucked up, I can blame Bondi, but I'm blaming him because he hired Bondi. When they fuck up the Comey prosecution, that's on him. Like, I like that the president is accountable and can be blamed and praised for the things he does, rather than having these layers of bureaucratic nonsense in place.
Imagine this, right? Like, I think that Joe Biden was out to lunch with cognitive issues for much of his presidency anyways. But let's say he appointed, and correct me if I'm wrong, Hillary Clinton has a law degree, right?
Yeah.
What if he appoints Hillary as DOJ and she's like, okay, we're investigating Trump? Are people like, oh, that's fine then? It wasn't Biden, it was just Hillary at the DOJ. Does that make you feel more comfortable? It's like, well, as long as the attorney general, I assume they're operating independently. I would be like, well, Hillary's probably making more decisions than Joe Biden, who largely seems like a figurehead anyways. So what's this degree of separate? Now, I understand the sort of plausible deniability and why from a legal standpoint you would want that. But as far as like realistically, does it really matter? Do you think it really matters that Jack Smith, clearly someone who had a partisan axe to grind? Well, as long as it's Jack Smith and not the attorney, not the AG, then it's all on the up and up. So like this whole thing, as always, there is one thing you can complain about Trump. I think that mostly they're all a bunch of shithead, all these politicians, not all of them, but you get what I mean. Vast majority of them are out for personal stuff. And even if they want to help people, they got personal access to grind and stuff like that. Trump's team has always been that's they're not as good as hiding it, right? The Democrats, they might say the right things, but we know what's going on. Yeah. Oh, no. This guy that stops working for Biden, is like number 2 at the Department of Justice and goes and takes a job under Alvin Bragg to help him carefully craft a case saying that, like, we could extend the statute of limitations on a misdemeanor by saying that there's 3 steps to this felony in a case that's never been brought to anyone before, but we're going to do for the first time for the president of the United States. I mean, come on, it's a joke. We all realize it, but people are going to be like, well, but we don't have any proof that Joe Biden's told him to do it. Yeah, we don't have proof Joe Biden said to do anything other than to get him chocolate chip ice cream. That doesn't mean that it's like somehow non-political. So I'm just tired of like the pretending like, oh, no, unless we have it like on writing that Joe Biden said to prosecute Trump, then it wasn't political. I'm willing to accept it's political. I'm willing to accept Trump's team does stuff that's political like this. This is the new normal. Sorry, it's the world they wanted.
Let's imagine a hypothetical world. I'm elected president, right? And I run on a campaign of, fighting corruption, particularly Democratic corruption. That's my platform. And then I get in office and I'm like, look, I want to make sure this is an independent investigation. I don't want to go after anyone politically. I want to make sure this is on the up and up. I'm all about fighting Democratic corruption. And that's why I've appointed Rob Noerrdor as Attorney General. Right. So Rob, independent, go, do your thing. I'm not signing any documents. I'm not saying anything. Are we supposed to believe that that has no politics involved? Like, I picked you because I know what your beliefs are. I know exactly what you're going to do as your Attorney General. Like, I've seen your stream.
Right.
Like, the whole thing is kind of a joke on some level, right? Like, you pick the people to fill the spots and then they do the job. And if I didn't like the job you were doing, I could fire you and get somebody else. I'm like, wow, it turns out Rob wasn't nearly as of a tack doggy as I thought he was. I need to find somebody who's even crazier about this. It's all a game at the end of the day. And like, I get that I'm a lawyer. I understand the impulse to reward people for playing the game skillfully, but you can still recognize it's a game.
Yeah. And this is why it was a mistake to bring. Look, I remember back when Gerald Ford died. And I don't know what year that was, but I remember one of the things I heard was like Ford, one of the things he's famous for was pardoning Nixon. Now, I didn't know anything about Watergate other than just surface level shit, And I remember being like, why is that something to celebrate? Screw that. If Nixon's guilty, he's guilty. Don't pardon the man, right? And now that I'm a little older and you look at it, you're like, well, I understand now. I understand that how dangerous it is to break that glass ceiling on, we're going to go after presidents, right? Because the impulse, it's going to be too juicy to be like, ooh, I could use the legal system now. I mean, imagine it. Let's say that somehow Trump could be held criminally accountable for these Venezuelan boat strikes. You think there isn't going to be one administration ever that the oncoming administration's not going to be like, well, any military action that they took, we're going to investigate legally now because that's just what we do. And it's like, that's driving the country in an even worse direction.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, for that pardon that's an act of political genius. That's an act of absolute understanding of the country and who we are. Because you're right, like once you ring the bell, it's real hard to unring this bell. You and I have argued about this before, where it's like, once you get into a cycle of political prosecution, how do you stop? Nobody's ever going to completely win. And if you don't completely win, the other side gets a turn. And when they get a turn, they're coming after you. And I've heard you argue about this with Pisco. He's like, well, these prosecutions were justified. And you're like, well, I think my prosecutions are justified. And you're stuck, right? And pardoning Nixon was just a masterstroke where you say, we have enough accountability. We don't need to, we don't need to belittle ourselves. We don't need to take a former president and put him before a jury and subject him to this, right? And I think really when it comes right down to it, and I think Pisco and people like him would admit this, they just don't view Trump the same way they view other presidents. Like to them, he's a bad faith president, right? So exceptions are warranted because of how bad faith he is. And I would agree he's a unique president, but in their zeal, and this is what happened with Dugan, it's a perfect bookend, right? In your zeal to treat him like a unique evil, you actually flush the whole system down the toilet. And that's a problem. Like it's a real serious thing. And sometimes people make fun of TDS, but that's definitional TDS.
Yeah. All right, Ryan, I think it was an excellent show today. What do you got coming up? You going to do any more streaming before Christmas here?
Probably not before Christmas. This is like the week of, I'm setting up some birthright citizenship debates because now I feel like I have an argument. So now I need to go out there and have somebody who's willing to like kick me in the teeth a little bit and try to make some counterpoints. Cause I feel like I'm at the risk of drinking Kool-Aid. So I'm going to try to set that up either on Sarah's or Wick's show, probably around New Year's. I'll give myself a few days off. And I'm going to be going over birthright citizenship with my buddy Lactoid with a fine-tooth comb sometime in the next couple days, but probably after Christmas. What are you doing, Rob?
So I was scheduled tentatively for a debate tomorrow, but I don't know that I could stream tomorrow night, so I've put that off. But I will be streaming usually around noon tomorrow, and then at 10 o'clock if everything goes swimmingly. And then I'm going to take Christmas off. So
good for
you. That's the plan. Well, Ryan, thanks so much for the show as always. Merry Christmas to you and your family. I hope you have a tremendous Christmas and New Year. And then I look forward to jumping back in here on the New Year. Who knows? Maybe we'll be out of legal topics to talk about with this administration. But I think not. I think that we'll have enough material.
Yeah, and if you can let me just make the appeal to the audience, my little baby channel got monetized. The gracious Rob Noerrdor dropped by and dropped a super chat the other day. Thank you, Rob. And a big reason why we got monetized was you guys and this spot and people from this show coming over and subscribing to my channel. So I really appreciate, Rob, the opportunity, and I really appreciate all of you who listen to me blab and are willing to come and drop by when I stream. So thank you guys so much. I'm deeply appreciative.
Well, when you become a Supreme Court justice, right, like hopefully you'll come on the show one time and we'll keep it, obviously you can't talk about pending cases, but we'll have some sort of conversation. So
yeah, this is the new era, right? The Supreme Court justices are like on live stream after oral argument being like, man, that lawyer sucked.
Crazy, right? Yeah, crazy. But, all right, Ryan, well, hey, thank you so much, man. I'm going to end this stream and raid right over into my next stream. But it's been a pleasure. And everyone who gave super chats, I promise I will read them on the next stream here. So, all right, for both Ryan and I, Merry Christmas to you all. Happy New Year. And we'll see you all in 2 weeks.
Night, everybody.
Night.